All right, give me just a second here. Yeah, set this up. All right. Well, this has been a really informational morning. I'm hoping that most of you that are watching are feeling the same way. And I'm really appreciative to Wild Farm Alliance for putting this on and figuring out how to navigate the field days in our COVID area where we are. I was wondering what this would be like, and it's pretty cool. You know, we're all probably more of us than might be able to make it are here just because of travel and things. So it's really great, and I'm getting to hear a lot of cool stuff. Obviously, Sasha in Missouri may not be able to make it out here to California to Davis Home Ranch. Who knows? But I'm very appreciative, and I've really enjoyed hearing everyone else's work. And I think that what I have to say will be a compliment to what everyone else has shared. So today I'm going to be talking to you about healthy soils and beneficial birds. And, first talk a little bit about, why we care about healthy soils and how healthy soils help attract beneficial birds. And what are some of the services provided by birds? So you've heard a lot about that already, and I'm not going to go into a ton of depth because you've heard so much great stuff, but I am going to provide a few examples and then give you a couple of options for how you can implement healthy soils practices on your farm. If, of course, you are here in California, I apologize to those of you who are not. So let's see. Okay, great. It advances very easily too. So just to give a little introduction to Audubon and Audubon, California. I work at Audubon, California, which is a state office of the National Audubon Society, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. Our mission is to restore and conserve natural ecosystems, focusing on birds, other wildlife, and their habitats for the benefit of humanity and for the Earth's biological diversity. So that's a pretty meaty mission statement. And, as an organization with a national office that's based in New York and DC, with 20 some odd state offices, and then we have independent chapters as well, we are doing things that, that relate to this mission. And because we are a fairly large organization that has those different national and state and local structures, we have a set of strategic priorities that we work on. And there are 5 of those priorities, including coasts, working lands, water, bird-friendly communities, and climate. So today I'm going to be focusing mainly here, let's see, you see my mouse now, on the working lands. And that's really where I have focused my work. And here in the Central Valley is mostly where our state office focuses on working lands, although there are other areas in the state that are producing crops. We have focused our project portfolio here in the Central Valley. And my work in the last 10 years or so has really been, I've had a big focus on rice. And worked a lot with the rice growing community. I'm usually up here talking about, or up here or on screen, or however you want to talk about where I am right now, talking about water birds and wetland habitat. And I know Emily mentioned in the beginning, I might be talking about that bird returns program, but I'm not. I'm going to talk a little bit about a different program, and I'll show that to you, some other things that we're doing. So for working lands, we're going to overlap just a little bit with climate, but it's all going to be mainly focused about working on working lands. And how I've been pulling in some of this healthy soils work and how it contributes and why it's important to birds. So for any of us that have been in California, it's no secret that the Central Valley has lost much of the natural habitat that was once occurring, whether that was wetland habitat, riparian habitat, or grassland habitat. Again, I'm usually talking about wetland habitat, but you can see by this map, this really light blue line that kind of gets covered over by the green, but still should be going all the way down the valley is our riparian habitat. And we can see how much of that has been lost on this right-hand image. So you know, whatever habitat we are talking about, whether it's riparian or grassland or other sort of upland habitats, we've lost a lot of that. And it's because, as most people have talked about already, we have this really incredible fertile soil in the Central Valley that is producing, you know, 25% of the nation's fruits and vegetables. And as Sasha pointed out, 99% of all the walnuts that are produced in the US, and similar for almonds. So there's a whole lot going on in the Central Valley. And we also want to make sure that our birds still have habitat. And given what we see here with the landscape, it's not surprising that in North America, 1 in 4 birds have been lost in the last 50 years. This was a study that was published in Science. I believe this was in 2019. The years have gotten a little murky, everyone, with COVID. So I think it was 2019 that this study came out. I'm sorry I don't have a citation for it, but it is quite a few birds. And different bird guilds, you know, water birds versus forest birds versus grassland birds, have different rates of decline. But it's not surprising. You know, what's happening in California is not unique, right? It's happening in other places as well. So what's interesting is that the Central Valley is still a hotspot for migratory land birds. So this was a study that was released by Audubon's national science team. This actually did come out last year, and it's showing how important the Central Valley is for migratory land birds. So the image on the right-hand side of your screen shows the different parts of the Central Valley, starting up north with the Sacramento Valley. These different basins, as we call them, these are really good basins for planning purposes for folks like me who are working on the ground planning and conservation in the Central Valley. We break it up into these 4 parts: the Sacramento Valley, which is where, you know, Rachel was talking about, and that's where Davis Home Ranch is. Then there's the Yolo Delta Basin, the San Joaquin Basin, and then the Tulare Basin. And those bars that are raising up above are showing the millions of birds that pass through. The dark blue is in spring and the light blue is in fall. So despite how dramatically the landscapes have changed, this study is showing that birds rely on the resources that remain along the river corridors. The birds are relying on the resources that everyone has shown you so far in the hedgerows. It's super, super important. And we're hoping that work like this can show us more where to put these types of habitats. So in the 4 Central Valley regions, collectively, there are about 65 million migratory land birds in the spring that were hosted and 48 million in the fall. And if you're curious about how this was done, this data was taken from the very popular eBird platform that allows people to go out and note where they see birds. And there was a modeling exercise developed with a Partners in Flight that allowed the national science team to estimate the total birds. So it's a really fantastic thing to see that birds are still using the Central Valley habitat. So, and it's my job as a conservationist to add habitat back on the landscape where it's possible, which brings me to the healthy soils. And you might be wondering, you know, why do we care about healthy soils? And we care, and I'm gonna get there, and I'm gonna start by telling you that the state has this incredibly ambitious climate goal to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2083. So this has all started with a number of different policy measures, with AB 32 back in 2006, where we set a greenhouse gas reduction target to just 1990 levels by 2020. And these more ambitious goal of 40% below 1990 levels was set by Governor Brown before he left office. What's important about this is that natural and working lands are poised to be part of the climate solution. And so when I say natural and working lands, I'm talking about rangelands, I'm talking about forests, woodlands, I'm even talking about wetlands and coastal areas, grasslands, shrublands, importantly farmland, riparian areas, and urban green spaces. So there is a natural and working lands climate implementation plan that was released, and that has goals for increasing the rate of state-funded soil conservation practices and also increasing the rate of state-funded oak, woodland, and riparian reforestation in addition to other practices. So we're getting closer here. We want to be, increasing these soil conservation practices and riparian and oak woodland restoration. So as part of this effort, there was a Healthy Soils initiative that was started in 2017. And this is a collaboration of state agencies and departments that promote these healthy soil practices on farmlands and ranch lands. And there's an objective of the Healthy Soils program, which is goes right along with the Natural and Working Lands initiative, which is to increase the statewide implementation of conservation management practices that improve soil health, sequester carbon, and reduce the atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. And they do this in 3 ways. One is providing financial incentive to California farmers and ranchers for agricultural management that sequester carbon and reduce the greenhouse gases. They also fund on-farm demonstration projects that collect data that showcase these conservation practices in action. And then they create a platform for promoting the widespread adoption of conservation and management of these practices throughout the state. So the things that we are talking about here today are many of the practices that are included. The Healthy Soils practices are actually broken down into 3 main agricultural types. There's cropland, practices you can implement on your cropland, practices you can implement on your orchards or vineyards, and then finally practices that you can implement on your rangeland. The cropland suite of practices actually hosts 23 different practices. There's 11 practices that are applicable to orchards and vineyards and 8 that are applicable to rangelands. And I'm not going to go into all of these, but what is really important is that the things that we're talking about today, we've heard people mention cover crops. We've heard people mention hedgerows, conservation cover, riparian restoration. These are all what I call bird-friendly healthy soils practices. These are practices that are being offered through these programs that are good for the Healthy Soils initiative, that contribute to the state's greenhouse gas emission goals, and that are also good for bringing in our beneficial birds. So some of the benefits of healthy soils practices, Rachel mentioned some of these earlier, just in terms of what are the benefits of hedgerows. Since hedgerows are a healthy soils practice, there's a lot of overlap here. And I haven't given as comprehensive of a list. I've just am talking about a few specific practices. 1, they attract beneficial birds. 2, they are important for water infiltration. 3, they are important for carbon sequestration, which is what helps them work toward the state's climate goals. And then lastly, they also help with erosion reduction. So improvements in water quality come from that erosion reduction and also from the water infiltration. When we get less water running off, when we have vegetation on a bank or somewhere along the edge of a field, when water runs off, it is slowed, and it's slowed by the vegetation, and it also has a chance to infiltrate down. So the roots aerate the soil, they improve the water infiltration, just the whole soil profile and soil health is improved. Rachel mentioned how there's so much going on below ground that we can't see. We can't even see it with our naked eye if we pick up the soil, right? But there are a ton of different benefits that can come from this. And when we slow down that water movement, one of the other things that we can get is some groundwater recharge. So just to mention too, Emily showed a picture like this earlier. This is their riparian, the very young stage of their riparian restoration at their, I forget the actual location of it, but I'll show it to you in just a second. So as an example of the nutrient filtration of a hedgerow and a healthy soils practice, Audubon with different partners, Sasha, I believe, mentioned this practice, and Rachel as well, initiated this practice in 2012 and 2013 to look at hedgerows across Leolo and Solano County, and to look at not only the bird use, but also the soil nitrate concentration. So we went out to all these different hedgerows. The pink hedgerows were, we went out to these different farm fields. The farm fields with the pink lines had weedy edges, and the farm fields with the green lines had hedgerows along those field edges. And it was those field edges with the hedgerows that you can see on the figure on the right had significantly reduced nitrate concentrations. And that was a really important benefit of having hedgerows on your farm. The other really important thing that I think other folks have talked about as well is that we see a dramatic increase in the bird species and just bird use of these hedgerows. So the bird species richness, this is the number of different species of birds that are using a hedgerow using the edge of a farm field. I keep saying hedgerow and I mean a farm field. The bird species richness along a farm field with a hedgerow increased by 30% when there's a hedgerow present compared to when there was just a weedy field edge. Bird abundance, just the sheer number of birds, increased by 40% around farm fields that had a hedgerow versus farm fields that did not. Native vegetation in a hedgerow increased the insectivorous birds by 60%, just like this bluebird that you see here, and we've noted, and I will show you some additional examples of some of the ways that birds provide services. And then finally, that native vegetation also increased raptors by 130%. And someone, I don't remember which presentation was, showed just how important raptors, I think it was Sasha, was showing some pictures of the predation of raptors and these insectivorous birds and how they can provide those services. So if we look around the Central Valley in general, so all these little red lines that I'm showing you here, this is the Central Valley. These are all of the water delivery canals. These are all of the aqueducts. This is like all the potential that we have in the Central Valley for adding back some habitat, whether it's a hedgerow, whether it's a filter strip, whether it's riparian, whether it's some sort of conservation cover or upland habitat. We have so much potential, and imagine the number of birds that we could bring back. And when I say birds, I am referring to the beneficial birds in particular. So there's a lot of potential in the Central Valley. And as one of our late partners said, every farm has a parcel that can be restored to natural habitat. Emily showed you a different version of this figure earlier in her presentation, and you can see all the different places at Davis Home Ranch just around the farm headquarters where they have implemented these different kinds of habitat, riparian restoration. This area over here, the light green, is the picture I showed you earlier, the hedgerows. It all comes together, when you piece and start things together. And every farm has some unproductive area, and every farm has farm edges or canal edges that can be restored to natural habitat and improve that habitat connectivity. So Davis Ranches has implemented a number of these different practices, and I just want to end by sharing some examples of the services provided by birds. Sasha gave a much longer list. I'm going to be focusing on just talking about some of the pest control services that birds can provide. There's just a whole, I think it's easy to talk about pest control services because it's more of a quantifiable, but we also just really like to look at birds and see birds on our property and see the biodiversity. But let's look at some of the examples that I have for you and just some of the cool birds that show up at Davis Ranches from that beautiful mural on their barn. So blackbirds. I know blackbirds can be considered a pest by a lot of farmers. However, at a conservative estimate, 75% of a tricolored blackbird's diet consists of insects. So whether it's a tricolored blackbird or maybe what you see more commonly up here is a red-winged blackbird, they are consuming a lot of different insect pests. And a study that was done found that the injurious insects compared to the beneficial insects, there were 16-to-1 of the pest insects consumed to every one beneficial insect. And blackbirds and other birds, as Rachel mentioned, are feeding their young more insects in the spring, and they're consuming more insects in the spring because that's when their diets, they're feeding the insects to their young. So blackbirds, they feast on several different types of pests: weevils, cutworms, alfalfa loopers, and flies. And they, will be attracted to blackberry and different hedgerows around a farm. Another example that's been brought up already are herons and egrets. And this is some information from a pilot study that was conducted by Sarah Cross, who I know many on this call know. They provide valuable services in alfalfa and other places. Sarah and her team looked at bird counts and performed bird counts, and they found that herons and egrets on average consumed 2.2 rodents for every 5-minute observation. And the maximum number of rodents was 20 rodents in 5 minutes. So huge, huge service here that herons and egrets are providing. And then my final example is coming up, and it's looking at something similar to what Sasha did. And actually Sasha put together this literature review for Audubon, California, looking at bird use of almond orchards and other nut tree crops. And similar to what she showed in Walnut Orchard, their birds are great predators of the navel orange worm that is harbored in mummy nuts. And so birds are using and helping that pest control by basically removing anywhere from 2 to 96% of the mummy nuts. And that it was higher on orchard edges than it was in the interior. But interestingly, the bird use and the depredation of these navel orange worms was positively correlated with the number of plant species in the orchard understory and with the proportion of the habitat within 1 kilometer of the orchards, which Sasha also shared with us as well. So I just want to leave you with a couple of ways that you can, a couple of resources for you as a landowner, as a farmer. You can get involved with the Healthy Soils program, which is sponsored through the Department of Food and Agriculture. There is an incentive program that is available directly to landowners and producers to implement these healthy soils practices that also help birds on your land. So this is a link to their website. They have an incentive program every year, and it has gotten pretty great reviews from the landowners that have used it. And then finally, I just want to leave you with also an opportunity to be part of a local regional conservation program with the rice community that we have going on today. I mentioned a lot of my work has been in rice. In our next program, we have added a couple of new program elements that include the implementation of a cover crop and also the implementation of conservation cover, which is more or less the implementation of some upland habitat in grasses and forbs as well. Also very good for birds. So those are just a couple of the ways that you can get involved. And if you have any questions, I will take those from you now.
Thank you so much, Khara. That was really, really great. A lot of really important information that you shared. Thank you. I don't see any questions directly in the chat box to me or to the whole group. You might want to check to see if there's any that were sent to you directly. But if anybody has any questions, I think we have a minute or two. Oh, someone asked, what are mummy nuts?
Right. So oops, where am I here? You can still, whoops, let's not go backwards. I'm moving things here on my screen, apologies, when I was trying to look for the For the chat box. So the mummy nuts, these are nuts that are left on the tree after harvest, and they harbor this navel orange worm, which the larvae grow in those mummy nuts, and then if they're left in the orchard, the adults grow up, right? And then there's crop damage when those are left in the orchard after harvest. So the mummy nut is the actual thing that's left over.
Great.